Today's episode is part one of my conversation with Simon Rinne. Simon has lived with mental illness for over 30 years. Depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and burnout are all challenges he's been working through over the years. Simon started Mindful Men in 2021 to share his story and help normalize discussions about mental health. His aim is to encourage boys and men to open up, get vulnerable, and deal with the issues that are troubling them. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation and that it helps you feel less alone. Good morning, Simon. How are you?
I'm good, Beth. How are you going today?
It's great. It's great to meet you. And
Absolutely.
you are the founder of Mindful Men in Australia, correct?
Yes, that is very correct.
And we are going to be talking about that towards the end of this episode. So listeners want to stay tuned for all of that information and where you can contact Simon. Today, we're going to be talking about Simon's OCD journey. And why don't you go ahead and just first introduce yourself and let everybody know who you are, where you live, what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Simon, I turned 40 last year, so I'm now in my 40s eventually, finally. And the founder of Mindful Men, which is a therapy practice dedicated to men's mental health and disability. And a lot of that's driven by my OCD story, my mental health story, which has been around for 30, 35 years now. And it's one of OCD, depression, anxiety, reliance on alcohol, suicidal ideation. I've burnt out in 2020. So I've had a lot of going on, but I use that pain for my purpose in my therapy clinic. So I'm a therapist in therapy, I like to say, and really loving it every day that I get to do this work, and it is really amazing. And if you haven't gotten on, my I guess accent is from Australia, so I'm in Queensland, a place called Queensland on the coast. I've got a beautiful family. I've got two little ones, a 7 and a 4-year-old, and my
Oh,
beautiful wife, and living the dream almost, you could say.
sounds like you have and I have a lot in common as far as our background with our mental health issues and the way we've coped all these years. I've lived with OCD for over 60 years. So I know exactly where you're coming from. So, why don't you tell me a little bit about your type of OCD that you have? Is it contamination? Is it harm OCD?
Yeah, so there's probably three elements to it, and it's evolved over time as well. But and then different elements come at different periods of my time. But there's three big ones. So harm OCD, this overwhelming fear of people harming myself or me, or the absence of my, I guess, compulsive behaviors harming other people. Just right OCD, so perfectionism has been a huge part of my life, and having to have things perfect, otherwise my brain goes into overdrive and my behaviors go into overdrive. And pure O, so I think pure O might have been one of the earliest ones, but it comes and goes, and it really impacted me in my career as well. So a lot of rumination to the point where I lose track of, ruminating, or should I say, I'll step back, ruminating so much on an event, say Friday night drinks after work, to the point where I lose track of what actually happened and what my brain is trying to tell me happened as well. So almost like distorted memory as well. So yeah, those are the three themes that regularly pop up for me. Over my journey.
Mhm. And when did it first start, or when did you first notice symptoms?
Yeah, so I was 8 years old. So we're talking about, I think it was the late 80s, early 90s. I'm not great with timelines, but
You're
it
such
was a
a
long time
you're such
ago
a
now.
young person. You're so young. Oh my gosh.
It's a lifetime ago now. I remember this very vividly. I was in the schoolyard, and another student who I didn't really know. It was just someone who was in another class. I barely knew him. I don't think I've ever seen him again since this day. But they said to me, Simon, if you stop using your voice for more than a minute, you're going to lose your voice forever. So this created the O in me, the obsessive thought, like, oh my gosh, I need my voice. I'm a laugher. I'm a joker. I'm a happy-go-lucky kid. If I lose my voice, that's the end of my world. And so to alleviate that, I started humming every minute just to check that my voice was there. So I do mm, mm, every minute just to check. And I would do it so quietly that nobody ever heard me do this. And I was doing it in the classroom, I was doing it at home, I was doing it on the sports field. Probably doing it in my sleep. I don't know,
Isn't it
but
something? Wow.
and this lasted for 2 years, and this is where it all started, and it morphed into the harm OCD stuff a little bit later on. But that's where it all started, in a schoolyard, and I wished at the time I knew that people took these silent sabbaticals and they wouldn't talk for a year or two or three or four or whatever. I wish I knew about these people, because then I would have maybe told myself, like, no, it's going to be okay. I don't have to talk every minute. But yeah, that's where it all started for me, in the schoolyard.
Oh my goodness. And then what happened? Go ahead and just start telling your story.
All right. So that lasted about 2 years, and during that period as well, I was doing these peculiar things, and to this day, I don't know why I was doing these things, and I've actually found myself recently doing these things as well. But I would get my finger and I would kind of like write cursive words on my arm or cursive words on my leg, and I'm not sure why I was doing it. I would keep doing these words until they were just right, until they were perfectly lined, and the calligraphy was all there. It was all invisible because it was just at the tip of my finger, but I don't know if it was a sensation thing. I'm not sure what the O component of this part is. So this is where I think maybe pure O was just doing its thing. But I was doing that for quite a while, and the humming thing. But it all really kicked off. I say really, but that those 2 years were terrible, humming to myself. Um, Around 13, roughly, my mum and dad separated. And so me and my little brother, we had a household of four brothers. Me and my little brother went with my mum and lived with my mum. And I felt this overwhelming need to be the man of the house, because that was a thing back when I grew up. There was a man of the house in every household that I went to. All my friends, usually the dad figure, the father figure, or an uncle or a big older brother. But me as a 13-year-old suddenly became that man. And every night I would go to bed and be absolutely petrified about what lies outside of the walls of our household. And so I would religiously go around the house checking windows were closed, blinds were closed so that people couldn't see in the house. The doors were all locked and wouldn't budge. And I was really fearful that someone would might break in and either steal our stuff, which we didn't have much, living with mum. So my mum had to go buy a whole household full of furniture for us, all secondhand or giveaways, or they would kidnap us, or they would murder us. And these were the obsessive thoughts that were going through my mind. And then to add on to that, I developed this fear of the house burning down while we were in it. And so I would go around the house checking that the fridge was fully closed, because I thought that if the fridge was slightly open, we had one of those old fridges with the seals that wasn't quite working as well. So maybe that might create the motor to overload and then burn down the house where we're sleeping. Or if the iron was left on or the stove was left on and something caught alight, that we would burn down, in our sleeps. And so I would religiously go around checking all these things, and I'd do them in certain orders. Like, it might start with the front door and do the front room, and then I'd progress through the back of the house. And then some nights I'd even go outside and check the gates outside in the freezing cold of winter or the boiling hot of summer, and do this for 3-4 hours a night as a 13-year-old. And every time I would think that I've checked everything, I'd go to bed, put my head on the pillow, and my OCD brain would say, Simon, you forgot to check that door or that window. And it wouldn't just be going to check that door or window, it would be the whole process again. So, what could be for most people like a 5-minute process, for me was 20 minutes at the best. So do the whole lot again, and then I'd get back to bed, and then my brain would say, Simon, in the process of checking that door again, somehow you pressing on it to hear that just right sound, thud, click, whatever, has unlatched the lock. So off you go again, and again and again and again. And then the day would come and it wouldn't stop. So leaving the house, if I was with mum and she was locking up the house, it's fine. I don't have to stress about it. But if I was like me going to the bus or whatever to go to school, I'd be checking and checking and checking, making sure that house was, like Fort Knox, and nobody could get in while I was at school. And then on the way to school, I'd be checking my wallet and keys were always in my bag, because I feared that if they had dropped out of my bag, one, The wallet might have my address on it, like on a student card, or when I got my license, that was particularly prevalent as well. And then this bad person that I had in my head would know where I lived, which was just terrifying to me. And add to that, if I lost my keys, they'd have a means to get in my house. And
Absolutely.
so constantly checking my bag, and then so you see me going to school with my backpack on. Well, I don't know if you see me, but I knew this was happening. And I would pull my bag off and I'd check this front pocket where my keys and my wallet are. And then when I got a phone, my phone became part of the process as well. And then when I became a professional, my business, my work pass became a thing as well. And I would check these things, then I'd put my bag back on, and then my brain would say, Simon, in the process of checking, something's happened and the keys have fallen out or the wallet fell out because you touched them. And so I'd look around and try to see if there was anything on the footpath, and there wasn't. And then I'd check the in my bag again, and repeat all day long. And so when I got my license, so when I started driving, it turned into, is the handbrake on? Because if that handbrake isn't on in the car and there's a slight hill, even if it's on a flat surface, that there's a risk that car will roll down the hill, cause mayhem, maybe crash through a building or kill someone walking across the street, or all these types of things. So constantly checking those things. Is it on hard enough? But also checking, similar to the house, are the windows all up? Are the doors all locked? And this was before they had the press button, locks on the cars, and you used to have to get the key in there and turn it
Right.
and all that type of stuff, or push the little button down and hold the handle up and then close it at the same time. It was all during that time, and so constantly checking, is the car safe? And then also adding to that, is there a light on inside? Because I've really feared that if I somehow left like the headlights on, or if I left the light internal on, it would run the battery flat, and then I'd be in a whole world of pain trying to. I didn't have the skills to just call up roadside assistance and say, "Can you help me out?" Because I also didn't have the money as well, so I feared spending money on stuff like that. So all these things would happen, and these themes have pretty much stayed with me as now I'm a 40-year-old. Thankfully, though, I'm in a position these days where it's not 3-4 hours a night. It's not me going back to my car after 20 minutes, or me walking 10 kilometers away or whatever to uni or to work or whatever. It's not me returning to the car to check it. I'm a little bit more relaxed about it these days. I've got a lot of coping strategies that I rely on. But then I'll get into, I guess, the rumination stuff that I touched on briefly. And I remember going to after work drinks and making an absolute mess of myself. I would get so drunk that I would be the life of the party. And actually people would celebrate it, and they would say, oh, Simon's out, he's having a good time, he's dancing around, he's telling great jokes, he's got a big smile on his face, which is a bit unusual for me. I'm a very serious person when I was in the workplace. But then what would happen is after that night, I'd have a great time, get home, life of the party, love it. The next day, my brain would start ticking. My OCD would start ticking. Say, Simon, when you were at that party, you said something or you did something that was going to cause huge offense to somebody else or huge impost. And then on Monday morning, you're going to be brought into that manager's office and absolutely berated and maybe lose your job. And so I would spend all weekend ruminating so much and so fast, trying to check. This is where this checking keeps coming in, trying to check the night's events in my head, to the point, as I said before, where I forgot what actually happened, and my brain would start telling me things of what would happen, and I'd cause so much anxiety that I'd vomit, I'd get diarrhea, my gut would just be churning. And this is particularly the one that prompted me to go and get a diagnosis in the first place. It was about 2 years of me doing this, and my wife said, Simon, you've got to stop drinking. You've got to, go get some help. And I'd always deflect and say, no, I'm okay. It's not me, it's you. Maybe you need to go and get some help. But eventually, after 2 years, she said, Simon, you either get help or you're out. I'm like, okay, maybe now this is the time. And this is when I was 28. So between 8 and 28, I never told anybody about all these things I did. I just felt like they were just peculiar little personality quirks for me, but nobody ever questioned them. Nobody ever talked about them. Maybe I hid them really well in my day-to-day life. I wore the mask very well, that I was okay, but internally I wasn't. And so at 28, finally got the courage to go and see a GP and see my doctor and say, I think I've got a mental health condition. I'm not sure what's going on. And that led to me getting a referral to a psychologist. And the psychologist said, we did a few tests, and the psychologist said, oh, Simon, you've got depression, which I figured I had. You've got this thing called anxiety. I'm like, okay, didn't know I had anxiety, but sure. You've also got this thing called obsessive compulsive disorder. And I'm like, what's that? And so we did a bit of, looking into that. But interestingly enough, she never treated the OCD. And in fact, a lot of the therapists that I had seen since then, over about 11 years, nobody treated the OCD. Nobody knew how to treat the OCD. Everyone was focused on depression and my drinking, but not even the anxiety. It was all around the depression and the drinking. And so I was fortunate after I burnt out in 2020. So I've got a burnout story as well, that I started sharing my stories through Mindful Men. I created an Instagram page. It started with an Instagram page sharing about OCD, but also depression, burnout, etc. And that's where I found an OCD community, which was like, oh, I didn't know other people lived with OCD. I thought I was the only person in the world. And they started talking about this thing called exposure response prevention. And I'm like, okay, now's the time for me to go and treat OCD and learn more about that. And yeah, eventually I did. And that's, I guess, where I've developed some strategies, and I've kind of kept going. And this is the OCD brain in me. I've kept going, but, and I'll stop right now. But yeah, that's essentially the journey. And there's been lots of other things as well. Suicidal ideation. I remember when I was a teenager, being up all night with those things, it was exhausting, and then doing it all day, every day. And I remember some nights putting my head on the pillow, just wishing I didn't wake up. And, but affirmations became a part of my life then as well. I remember one night being in that room after doing it for about 6 hours, and I hadn't slept, and I was anxious about the next day. And something popped in my head, and I put my head on the pillow, and I thought, I hope I don't wake up. But then something popped in my head, and have no idea where this came from. And it said, Simon, no matter how dark today is, the sun will always rise tomorrow. And I saw that as a beacon of hope, and I've held on to that one ever since. So every time I get dark, and every time I get really stressed and the OCD flares up, I just think of that quote, and it pushes me forward and pushes me to do things like what we're doing right now, to talk about what's essentially been the pain for so long, but it was also now my purpose. It's something that I really use as fuel to better myself, but also support other guys to talk about what's going on for them too. So yeah, I did go on for a bit, so I'm
That's
sorry.
okay. I wanted to go way back. You may have answered
Yes.
this, but so when you were doing all this as a child, your mom didn't
Yeah.
notice, your brothers didn't notice? They were just sleeping.
No.
They were
So
just
they were
all
sleeping.
sleeping, and
It was in the
it
dark,
didn't really.
walking around the
How about
house.
at school? Nobody noticed all this? Okay, well, that
No.
that's that's a catch 22, because I was just wondering if maybe you were teased about it, if you were excluded because of your
No.
behavior. And,
No.
wow, you did keep that hidden well. That's
If I was
incredible.
to look at if I was to put myself as a character in school, I was the jock. I was the alpha male personality. So I was the one who was always doing the sport. I was the one that people always wanted to pick me on their team first, and I was the captains of the sports teams. And that was the mask I had on. I was very strong, tough. Growing up in the 80s, 90s, noughties, it was the suck it up mentality. I played football. I did lots of sports. I grew up with three brothers, so I had to kind of be tough in my own household.
Right.
And it continued at school. So, but on the inside, I was the complete opposite person. I was a broken boy who was so scared of the world, so worried about what if I looked at someone and they looked at me and we caught eyes. Oh my God, that's the OCD would just go, they're out to kill you.
Mhm.
They're looking at you because you're the next victim. And that I thought about that because I also went to a really rough school. My first day of high school saw one kid get his nose broken, another girl get her head smashed against a brick wall. It wouldn't be unusual for people to walk around my school with weapons in their bags, knives, bars, all sorts of things, be parts of gangs. And so I was petrified as a kid, and I just thought I was the next victim. Interestingly enough, I was probably my own bully because I never was a victim. Nobody ever picked on me. Nobody ever bashed me up. Nobody ever did anything to me. Sure, every now and then someone might throw something my way or whatever, but that's kids being kids. It
Right.
wasn't someone that was targeted at me. And so, yeah, never noticed, never bullied, never ostracized. I did that to myself through the
Mhm.
OCD. So it was more of a battle with my internal OCD persona.
Mhm. Uh, did when you were younger, did you ever think to yourself, "This doesn't make sense? Why I'm different than everybody else? Why am I thinking these things?" Or did you just think nothing of it? Like,
Yeah, I was tired a lot from it, but I never thought anything of it.
oh, I can
You
imagine you were
know,
tired. Didn't get any sleep. My gosh.
I just it just felt like that was just my normal. I didn't know
Mhm,
any other difference.
mhm,
And the thing is, though, like we nobody ever talked about mental health,
mhm,
or and particularly men's mental health, boys' mental health. It was suck it up, be a man. And so I sucked it up, and I was the man, and I didn't talk about it. These days, as I got older, and certainly in my 30s, since the diagnoses and being aware of it, and some people say that they're not their diagnoses, but I find diagnoses are really helpful just to understand who we are. That's when I start to go, why? I wish I was just like everybody else and could shut my brain off, and I didn't need 6 bottles of beer to do that, for
mhm,
example. Or I wish I didn't have to be on medication. I wished. But at the same time, I wouldn't be here doing this amazing work, and if I hadn't gone through all of that type of stuff. So I kind of try to look at it like that way. I wouldn't have this amazing business. I wouldn't be working one to one with men. I wouldn't be talking to you in the middle of the morning
mhm.
um, about OCD if I hadn't gone through all of that. So I find there's a bit of a blessing there as well,
That's
that I
right.
can use that pain to inspire other people around the world to go, oh,
Mhm.
I've been doing this humming thing too. Maybe I should go talk to someone about that. or I've been checking my bag a million times. Maybe there's something more to it as well. Maybe it's time for me to go and talk. And I think we're in an age where it's a bit more accessible to talk about your mental health. It's a bit more okay, particularly for guys. We're recognizing that it's okay. And I thank COVID for that. COVID has allowed
Mhm.
a lot of people around the world to check in with each other and check in with themselves and go, you know what? I'm not doing okay.
That's
I
about the
need some
time when you
help.
started this, right? Was during COVID?
When I burnt out,
Yeah.
yeah, so I
Mhm,
burned out in 2020. So I was studying my Masters of Social Work part time. I was working full time. We had 2 kids under 3. I had my mental health story, and then COVID came along, so we were locked down. And in this very room, I remember being on the phone call to my manager because my workloads were getting a little bit sloppy. They were taking longer to do. I was checked out. My brain was checked out at work, and I remember bawling my eyes out. This is the first time I've ever cried in front of anybody outside of my wife and my kids, and I bawled my eyes and said, "I'm burnt out." And when we explored it, a lot of burnout for me was perfectionism, trying to be perfect, which came from my OCD. It was this thing that I've learned in my life to be perfect as much as possible, and that ultimately resulted in me having to stop, take off this mask, and say, I'm not this hyper alpha male that I've been trying to live for my whole life. I'm actually someone who's soft, who's vulnerable, who needs more authenticity, needs more connection, needs more loving. Here I am now. It all came out as a blubbering mess in 2020. And this is where Mindful Men was born, from that, just wanting to be more authentic and share stories and heal in a way that isn't me locked away in a room by myself. It's something that's more collaborative with people around the world.
mhm. Do you have any specific triggers right now? Or is it just come and go, like, for no reason?
Yeah, these days it's more around just stress. So when
Mhm,
I'm stressed, I just get triggered and it flares up. When I was younger, certain things would happen. So it might be, as I said, someone locking eyes with someone who I perceived as a threat to me. That would be a huge trigger. One, say, for example, the summer holidays here, where we finish school mid to late December, and then we'd have about 6 to 8 weeks off over the summer break, which is in our December period. So we'd go back to school around late January. If I locked eyes with someone in that last few days of school, I would be ruminating about that person for the entire 6 to 8 week holiday period. It would never leave my brain, fearful that when I get back to school, I was the next threat, I was the next target, and so forth. So those were big triggers, and I would often look down. I'd sit on buses or trains and look down, or walk to school looking down. trying to avoid people's, seeing people look at me essentially. Was very scared. That was a huge one for me. But also, I don't know, seeing other things, other people doing weird things, or maybe seeing a car broken down. So that might trigger my car thing, with what's going on. But these days, it's more just around stress. I recognize it's more of a stress response, particularly as having my own business now. I'm constantly stressed. So I'm very mindful about trying to manage that the best way possible, just to keep everything on track as well. But I also don't hesitate to go back to therapy if I need to. So I'm a therapist in therapy, and I know when I really do need to go and speak to someone, all the wheels have fallen off, and I'm crashing into a wall. So yeah, I'm very mindful of what's going on in my stress levels.
Even therapists need therapy, right?
Absolutely, and that's a taboo topic in itself. A lot of therapists are scared to share that they're in therapy, or to say that they're lived experience therapists. I actually love that. I love saying I'm a lived experience therapist, and I'm not going to hide away from that, because I've got the learned experience from the university degree. I've got the lived experience, and together that makes for a well-rounded approach to therapy, and ability to engage with people as well. So that is a bit of a taboo topic for therapists, and I've talked to many who say similar, like they want to share their story, or they even want to share that they go to therapy, but they're very hesitant. So I'm glad you touched on that.
Yeah, and I was wondering also, I don't usually have professionals on this channel. It's usually people just telling their story. So you're the first
Mm.
therapist that I've talked to so far. I was just wondering if you ever, you listen to so many people and all their issues. Do you ever feel like you take it so much on that it kind of bogs you down? Because that's one of the things I was worried about when I started this podcast, is that I'm an empath for one thing. And I was worried that I was going to hear all of these stories, these triggers, these compulsions, these intrusive thoughts. And then all of a sudden I was going to start, thinking the same things and doing the same rituals. I was afraid it was going to stress me out. It was going to make me sad, angry. Does that ever happen to you as a therapist? You get overloaded?
No,
You get overloaded with other
no,
people's stuff, or
no, not at all. Like, I
uh,
actually really enjoy it, and I've got a few clients that have OCD, and I love being in those moments with them, and hearing their story and how OCD impacts them. The moment I tell them, and I share a little bit about me as a lived experience therapist, the moment I tell them that I live with OCD, you just see their shoulders just go, ah,
mhm,
and like they're like, finally someone gets me. Because you can go and see an OCD therapist, specialist therapist, who hasn't lived with OCD.
right.
So they've got the book smarts, and when you find them and they're really good, I've got one that I go to. He's really good. He's really knowledgeable in OCD. But once you get someone with lived experience who gets all those weird and wonderful thoughts and behaviors, then it is so relieving. And so I cherish those moments. In fact, the only time it's actually impacted me is being a podcaster. So as a podcaster myself, I've had a few people that have come on and shared a bit about OCD, and I've heard about different themes that I don't really that scare me, actually. So there's one, pedophilia OCD. It's this fear of being seen as a pedophile or whatever, and that
Right.
scared me a little bit because I was a dad, and I'm
Mhm.
like, well, what happens if this becomes part of my OCD, and how would I take my child to the public toilet? You know,
Mhm.
and I don't want to be perceived as a pedophile, but I think when I put my rational hat on, I go, no, this is not part of my themes. My themes are the harm OCD, the just right, the pure O. That's just me learning about these different themes. And there's so many different themes as well around
There are.
OCD that we're not sure, that a lot of us aren't aware of. Um, so it was just more of me just being rational with myself and going, I'm not taking on this person's expertise who talked about pedophilia OCD, or there's sexual orientation OCD. So sometimes when we hear these things, we go, "Oh, is that my OCD?" um,
Yeah.
but no, I'm pretty
I
comfortable
don't think
where
it
my
works like
OCD
that.
themes are.
I
No,
don't
I
think it
don't think
works
it
like
does.
that.
I
So
think it
far,
starts to try.
yeah, so far it hasn't affected me. And if anything, it's been like a blessing to me, because I realized that I'm extremely lucky. When I
Mm,
talk to other people, I'm thinking, okay, Beth, you didn't have it so bad. You thought you had it so bad. And, I haven't been hospitalized 6 times for OCD. I haven't, um, So it's kind of just made me feel
Yeah.
like I'm blessed, in that way.
But on that, I'd just like to highlight, as a therapist, is like your story still matters, and often we don't share our story because we feel like it's not as bad as somebody else's story.
Hmm.
But it is just as it's not necessarily as bad, but it is as profound on your life.
Hmm.
And anybody listening to this as well who might have OCD and go, oh yeah, I haven't been hospitalized, or I don't have pedophilia OCD, or whatever, whatever one that they're conjuring up in their
Right.
head, is like, it's still okay to go talk to someone,
Right.
because just getting it off your chest could stop you from 20 years of silence, like what I had, or 25 years of alcohol use to numb the pain. It could stop you from doing that, because OCD is often considered the silent condition for first symptom to first treatments, on average 13 to 15 years.
Hmm.
Mine was 25, 26, 27 years. And so we don't have to suffer in silence there. And I love how you've got this OCD podcast, is to highlight that there's so many people around the world with OCD, and it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to share and learn from each other and draw inspiration from each other. And that's the beauty in storytelling and telling our stories. No matter how profound that we think it is,
Hmm.
the story is still worth hearing. So
Absolutely. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of my conversation with Simon Rinne. Please return next Monday morning for the conclusion of our conversation. Simon's social media contacts are listed in the show notes. We would love to see you in our Facebook group, where you can meet and get to know others who have obsessive compulsive disorder. Remember that OCD, while it cannot be cured, it can be managed, and I am living proof of that. I hope you all have a fantastic week, and I will see you next time on Around and Around the OCD Circle.